Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Let me introduce you to my guest. Joining us today is Merissa Khurma. Merissa is director of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Also with us, Lynn Mounzer. Lynn is a global fellow with that same Middle East program. She's also the lead researcher and co-author of the report, Women in Entrepreneurship in MENA, the Cases of Bahrain, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Welcome to both of you, Merissa and Lynn. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John, for taking the time to discuss all things entrepreneurship and women.
Yes, terrific topic, and thank you. And Merissa, why don't we start with you and tell us about the report. Give us the overview of your work in the region and what you're trying to learn.
Well, thank you, John. So this report really is the second flagship report that the Middle East program publishes. And the first one being the Women in Leadership in the Public Sector in the MENA region. One of the findings of the first report concerning correlations between the different indicators that we've looked at is one that looked at financial independence, asset ownership, and inheritance laws, and how unequal inheritance laws and the lack of asset ownership in the MENA region actually impacts women's leadership in the public sector. So we thought that that finding was super interesting. So we decided to delve deeper into the topic. And we thought one way to do this is to unpack basically women's access to finance through the world of entrepreneurship. The buzzword all around the region in many of the capitals across MENA currently is entrepreneurship. And while we know that it's not panacea to all of the region's economic problems, keeping in mind, of course, that it's a very young population, that youth unemployment is also very, very high, averaging about 20%, as high as 40% in Jordan and 35% in Tunisia. So it is a buzzword. But when it comes to women's entrepreneurship, and I'm sure Lynn will talk in more detail about the case studies, it's even lower than that. It barely scratches the surface to even 10%, and in some countries it's close to 3%. And we're really talking about very small and medium businesses. It's very hard to scale, it's very hard to export. There's so many different challenges that face all of entrepreneurs, but women specifically. And so we wanted to better understand this, and this goes back to also the work that we're doing in the Workforce Development Initiative at MEP, looking at all the different stakeholders in trying to basically just get the engines working in a different direction in order to create jobs, but also to address the systemic gaps in the labor force across the MENA region. And of course, there are variations across the different sub-regions and within each country as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Lynn, before we start talking specifically about some of the findings and recommendations, could you give us a little bit of the background on the choice of the three countries, Bahrain, Lebanon, and Tunisia, and then some of the methodology that you use to do the research?
Definitely. So we use the Gates Foundation Women Economic Empowerment model. It's to examine the barriers and enablers to women's entrepreneurship. We collected data on key figures and indicators related to women's economic empowerment, supplemented by in-depth interviews and literature review. Our finding, we'll delve deep into it, but reveals many improvements in the condition of women entrepreneurs, but there are significant challenges. We chose those three countries based on their sizes. They are the smallest within the three regions, Levant, North Africa, and the Gulf. They have different level of entrepreneurship, but they can learn from each other. And that's why, like Tunisia has been, women entrepreneurs in Tunisia has been doing this for longer than in Lebanon and Bahrain. So what can we learn from what's going on in the other countries? So we decided to choose these three countries. And then we looked at the findings on the challenges actually across two main pillars, fundamental enablers and opportunity and inclusion. We also found that the progress tend to be made in the fundamental enablers before addressing opportunities and inclusion.
Thanks. I'm going to ask both of you to talk about things that jump out of you of the findings. I'll list one and see what your thoughts are on that. Is that conventional wisdom would say that education is a key touchstone, and once you improve education and access to education, other things start to fall into place. That doesn't exactly emerge from these findings, right? We see that even when education is improving, women's access to education is improving. That doesn't have a one-to-one correlation with entrepreneurship.
Yeah, if I may jump in, this is drawn what the World Bank dubs the MENA paradox, because you would think that with gaps being closed in education in many countries in the region, including a few countries in the GCC, women are actually outperforming men in tertiary education, not just secondary education, but tertiary education. But that's not necessarily translating into the labor force. Female labor force participation is basically less than half of the world average, which is around 48%. And that is very unfortunate, but it comes with different barriers, not only barriers to entry, but barriers to stay in the workforce. So women may graduate from university, find a job for the first 2 years, and then other barriers are emerge as their personal lives change and evolves, and they start families. The setup for women in the workforce basically is not conducive for women staying in the workforce, but also advancing careers in the workforce. And I'm sure
did the pandemic set things back?
The pandemic did set things back in some countries. What we have seen, and this is a phenomenon, of course, that's not unique to the MENA region, is that women were the vast majority of healthcare workers. So they were frontline, basically at the front line of the pandemic, at the response. And so many of these women kept their jobs. But of course, the pandemic has affected them in different ways because their responsibilities at home did not change or shift. And so they became basically, paid workers in the healthcare system, taking risks in caring for those who have been infected with the disease that we did not understand the first year, and then going home and taking over all of the responsibilities at home. And so this has certainly affected dynamics and mental health. So it has impacted women for sure.
Lynn, I'd love to get your thoughts on the so-called MENA paradox, and if the findings give you any clue or any opportunity to explain it, why it's not having the impact that we thought it might.
That requires a different set of in-depth research. But what our research has found that it's because the outdated curricula that's available that actually affecting women economic participation and even entrepreneurship. We see a lot of the existing one doesn't answer to the market needs. So they're teaching women and men skills that it's not required for the future of work. They're not adjusting it accordingly. And there's also a lot of sociocultural factors that affect women education and entering the workforce after that. And biggest one is lack of focus on entrepreneurship. Everybody pushes. Across the countries, we found that women are pushed toward finding a safe job, which is usually a governmental job. In some countries, like especially in Bahrain, for example, we saw a high number of women in governmental positions, but not in the private sector. Again, the private sector doesn't provide an enabling environment for women to access and grow and stay in it, as Merissa just mentioned. So COVID sets things back because the first people who get out of school, the priority was for boys, not for girls. So we saw a lot of girls out of school because their family wanted them at home helping with their siblings. That's one of them. And women just go to work and come back and do another job. So they're burned out. At the end of the day, they left the workplace, especially during the pandemic. So in terms of education, curricula needs a lot of work, despite all the high degrees, and like women are more educated than men in the three countries, but it's not actually it's not transferring to the workplace.
Lynn, that thing you mentioned about a desire for government jobs because they offer, I think you call them safer jobs, more stability, I'm guessing, is part of that equation. What does that speak to as far as the private sector? Is it a lack of investment?
like an inclusion and diversity. So at once we have a private sector that is full of men and they do not see women as equal in a workplace. So you see a lot of women, they start in a junior position. They never get promoted to senior position because they leave even the workplace before reaching that. They face a lot of discrimination. They face a lot of pushback, whether from society or from the workforce. They face harassment, and that's why they feel like this is not the space for them. And again, flexibility. We talk about child labor, child support, childcare. The governmental job, most of them, they finish at 4 p.m. So the women are able to go pick up their kids and go home, teach them, whatever, take care of them. However, in a private sector, you're finishing at 7 p.m. and you're not providing any facilities for women to take care of their kids. Like, how can they be present? And throughout the region, throughout the 3 countries, there is no proper childcare facilities, even outside of the workplace, where proper whether governmental or non-governmental, they're actually not up to the standards. And if they are, they're super expensive. So women tend to decide to stay at home instead of having a job that will cost more than the childcare.
These problems sound so universal and sound very familiar, things we were even talking about off the air before we began recording. Merissa, let me ask you for more intel on this notion of the difference between the government and the private sector in creating an environment for an entrepreneurship. Are the governments in the region, the 3 nations that you looked at in the report, are they doing the things they need to do to stimulate entrepreneurship among women in these countries?
I think there are efforts across the board, and it's not just governments. And of course, there are different programs in the 3 different countries listed. So if we zoom into Bahrain, for example, there's more resources in Bahrain and more sort of political will on the part of the government to actually open up the space for more young people to take more risks, start their own businesses, and particularly for women. So the Supreme Council for Women in Bahrain works with government entities, civil society, as well as the private sector to ensure that women have access to finance, to capital, that they are able to export their goods and services. So they have a really good ecosystem. But of course, there are other barriers, and that's, goes back to social mindsets about taking risks. And, taking risks is not really part of the DNA and the socio-cultural context in the region. It's, going back to Lynn's phrase, safe jobs, safe and secure jobs. It's all about that. That's why most people tune into the public sector. And so the public sector in many of the countries in the region, with the exception, I think, of Lebanon, and that's a different case study in its own, is the largest employer. And at some point, you have more youth graduating than jobs provided by the government. And those governments are bloated at this point. And the private sector is not mature enough to be able to create enough jobs and absorb all of these new graduates, all these new entrants into the labor market. And so it is, of course, a much larger issue, but when it comes to women, other barriers exist. In some countries, in Tunisia, for example, transportation is a very serious issue, especially in the agro sector, in the rural areas. There are reports of deaths and accidents that happen that are primarily women are the victims because of unsafe buses that are being used to transport women to agro lands where they work. And so that is another issue. In Lebanon and in other countries like Jordan, Iraq, it's also safe transportation to urban centers, safe transportation, safe from sexual harassment as well. So I think these are all, part of the discussion about why you don't see more women basically entering the labor force or staying and making a career out of the work that they do.
I want to, at some point, move toward some of the recommendations you make and some of the best practices you identify. But before doing that, I just want to make sure both of you have touched on many different barriers and challenges. Are there any others that you uncovered in the report that we haven't mentioned yet that are worth mentioning?
Definitely. Let's talk about the legal rights, the environment. Again, we talk about an enabling environment, but then we don't, for example, I'll give you an example. Some countries define sexual harassment. In Tunisia, they define it as a repeated action. So how can a woman complain about sexual harassment or be safe if only if it's repeated, it can be punished. So the limited scope in the laws, some strides has been made in criminalizing workplace harassment, but the prevention methods and implementation mechanism are not in place. Another one, what else do we talk? We talked about mobility, and then we talk about digital inclusion, which is very important right now. Like we do have high level of digital inclusion for Bahrain, for example. The gender gap in access to the internet is only 1.1%. But like in Lebanon and Tunisia, it's far behind. And that's without having proper access to the internet, we don't have access to a phone, we don't have the proper infrastructure for that. Women are being left behind. And this is why we see less women in STEM industry. The third one is financial inclusion. I could mention all of them. Financial inclusion is still a main barrier. There's some programs like in Bahrain that they will support startups, but like none of these programs are actually helping women scale their businesses. They're just telling them it's good to be small, it's good to stay there. This is good for you. It's more of a hobby. That's some of women we interviewed, they mentioned that funders or like banks think of their businesses as a hobby. It's just a hobby, a side hustle, and that's it. They don't consider them as a real businesswoman and give them the support and everything else that they need. Last, I would mention a property and assets. So that also relates to financial inclusion. So women do not have access to land ownership. In Lebanon, one of the examples, only 9% of the land are owned by women, yet most of the land, most of the people in the agricultural sector are women. So this also always a paradox in the Middle East. So they don't have access to land. They don't have any assets in their name. We have a lot of cultural and religious and traditional practices that discriminate against that. So we end up, women don't have, cannot get a loan. They cannot help each other. They don't have anything to rely on to improve their businesses.
Well, then let's move on to some of the recommendations and best practices you've identified. What can you tell us in that regard?
I think
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to start with this and then turn it over to you, Lynn. So one of the things that has been consistent in actually so many of the reports that we've published and the research that we're doing is the paucity of reliable data. So we need sex disaggregated data across the board to understand where women are at, what are they doing, and that is very important. Case studies as well about what is working. So what are some of the policies that have actually worked? What are some of the success stories that need to be highlighted? Those also help with data collection because it's anecdotal and it does basically inform researchers as to, well, this is the contextual story of this data point, for example. So that's the main finding, I would say. So we need to invest in research, in data collection and data management and data sharing. The transparency aspect of it is very important. Lynn, if you want to.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're still working. Like sometimes I wonder, why are we talking? How can I keep writing about a subject that I have the same data on over and over again? And this is like part of this project the report was amazing because we relied on a lot of evidence from women, talking to a lot of women entrepreneurs and women in those 3 countries, creating a case study, trying to create like a learning experience from what's going on. But we do require data. This is the most important part. I would also mention the financial inclusion, which is common sense, because like there's no gender sensitive lending practices in the region. So we need to also diversify the venture capital. A lot of women mentioned going into a room full of men, pitching to them, feeling like the men couldn't understand their product because it's a more female related product. And that limited their access to funding. Second, I would say investing in women's skills and networks. We talk about, they do have the soft skills, but like we need to give them training to executive position, to executive level, more digital skills, a more industry specific knowledge. And that's what they lack, that the education system is not giving these women, as well as like a lot of fostering a networking and mentorship. We don't have enough networks among women entrepreneurs in the region. And if they are very limited. So they rely on a family connection, which usually they give this connection to the men in the family instead of the women, because they're more likely to be serious entrepreneurs in their perspective. So we need to work on that. I would say last, the legal reforms, of course, we cannot forget about that. It should address all the discriminatory laws to promote gender equality and to actually have equal rights and opportunities for women in the workplace.
If I may add, because back to this point of reforming laws and promoting policies that basically enable more women to enter the labor force and to stay in the labor force and to access finance, etc. It's important for these laws to be implemented. So implementation mechanisms are also important. This vacuum or this lack of implementation has been filled up by some civil society groups. So certain women's groups have come together to try to, for example, pressure the government to ensure that these newly reformed laws are being implemented, that the judicial system, that the judges, for example, are actually educated on how this particular legislation was reformed. So it's one thing to say, oh, we just reformed this law, and it's, it looks fantastic on paper, but there's always an implementation problem. So ensuring that there are mechanisms to implement and working with different groups on the ground who are already advocating on behalf of women and trying to ensure that there's accountability is also very important. And that's where the donor community comes into play to support some of these programs.
I want to tell our viewers and listeners that if you would like to read the report for yourself and other terrific materials that are available from the Middle East program, many of those authored by either Lynn or Merissa, just come to wilsoncenter.org, the website. And if you find the programs tab at the top of the screen, you can find the Middle East program, and all of these resources and more will be available there. And speaking of resources, Merissa, I want to shift gears to another exciting project that certainly overlaps with what we've been talking about, which is your Riyada podcast. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Riyada in Arabic means leadership or entrepreneurship. And so we thought naming the podcast Riyada would be a way to educate audiences here in Washington about basically entrepreneurship ecosystems in the region, who's doing what, who's entering that field, the different stakeholders, from the educators to the incubators and accelerators and the venture capitalist funds, as well as, of course, the government. So over the course of the last year plus, we've produced and disseminated 50 episodes that included entrepreneurs from across the MENA region, venture capitalists, investors, educators, those who are working in the ecosystem. And it has been a learning experience. Many of the findings that Lynn basically shared today from the new report on women in entrepreneurship are very much in line with many of the discussions that I had with women entrepreneurs in particular. the access to finance, not being taken seriously by investors, by incubators and accelerators, the networks that are available, that are not available or hard to find, to basically cross-pollinate with others. So there have been many sort of common threads and common themes in the challenges, but also the opportunities. Again, I think entrepreneurship is no panacea to the region's joblessness challenge, but it is a very important ingredient, because even for those startups that fail, those who have been through that journey have skills that are needed and are in demand in the labor market. Those are the essential life skills, or dubbed the soft skills. So those are some of the themes that have come up multiple times in my conversations with entrepreneurs from MENA.
Yeah, if you look at most successful entrepreneurs, there's a lot of failure on the way to ultimate success too. It's never just one and done.
Yes, and there is, a bit of I don't want to say culture of shame, but perhaps it's a bit taboo to talk about your failure openly in MENA societies. It's a cultural mindset, or perhaps a social mindset. But these things have been changing, because a lot of young people are basically lifting a lot of these barriers and pushing the envelope. They just need to be supported by the government. One thing that I heard from many young entrepreneurs is that there are still so many regulations in place that make it very difficult for them to move forward with their startups, or to scale in particular. And that's because young people are coming up with new and innovative ideas that don't necessarily have any codes in the government sector. So they need to sort of rephrase things, or register a social enterprise in 5 different ministries, because it doesn't just belong to one sector. So there's a lot of adaptability and flexibility that the governments have to showcase, and of course, access to capital and resources, and incentives. And in many countries in the GCC, this is happening, and it's happening very well, because there's more wealth, more resources. So the hope is that there will be more intra-regional collaboration amongst entrepreneurial networks, so that the ecosystem is feeding each other, or the different ecosystems are feeding each other into one big MENA ecosystem.
Thanks, Merissa. Lynn, I want to give you an opportunity for any final thoughts do you want to add to the discussion?
Well, yeah, I want to say, we need to work together, whether government, NGOs, private sector, civil society. We should work together to create this supportive environment for entrepreneurs in general, and specifically for women entrepreneurs. We need to this cooperation can address not only the legal and financial barriers that they face, but also the social and cultural one that limit the woman's potential. So it is important in order to achieve equality and increase women on economic participation and entrepreneurship in the region. We need this multifaceted cooperation to move forward, or else we're going to be stuck here. And there's a lot of amazing women that are actually creating very innovative ideas. We just need to support them and provide a platform for them to be present, because again, you cannot be what you cannot see. So let's highlight these women and let's present them to the rest of the region and the world, and let them succeed.
Well, Lynn Mounzer, Merissa Khurma, thank you for today, and also for the leadership you continue to provide in this important area.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, John.
And again, to our viewers and listeners, Middle East program at wilsoncenter.org, all kinds of terrific information that you can learn a lot from. And then if you want to get involved, you can help, because there are a lot of actionable ideas included there as well. So we hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for being here.